Let's start at the very beginning of this exchange because often that's where the most revealing truths lie. A young American girl, bright, articulate and courageous enough to raise her voice, posed a question to India's External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar. Now on the surface, it seemed like a simple challenge. She questioned India's foreign policy decisions. But if you look closely, what she was really doing was voicing something much larger than herself. She was speaking as a representative of a worldview, a deeply ingrained Western narrative that presumes to know what is right for other nations. This isn't to diminish her sincerity. In fact, I'd argue it came from a genuine place of curiosity mixed with a sense of moral urgency. But that's precisely why the question struck a chord, because it touched on a tension that has been simmering for decades between Western expectations and India's sovereign choices. Now imagine being in Jaishankar's position. You are confronted not with hostility, but with a type of well-meaning, almost paternalistic challenge. Why does India do what it does? Why doesn't India align with the so-called right side of history? There's an underlying presumption there, an assumption that one set of values, predominantly shaped by Western historical experiences, must be universal. And that's the crux of the conversation. Because when a young person asks such a question, she's not merely asking for a policy explanation. She's asking for justification. Why India chooses to act from its own vantage point rather than conform to an established Western framework. Jaishankar could have responded with platitudes or evasions. He didn't. He chose something much more interesting. He challenged the very premise of the question. That's an intellectually powerful move. It's like a good professor who, instead of answering you directly, forces you to reconsider the lens through which you're even asking the question. He did what an effective diplomat, and I'd argue a serious thinker, must do. He re-entered the debate. He reminded everyone in that room that India does not see itself as an appendage of some larger Western-led project. It sees itself as a sovereign actor with its own moral, strategic, and cultural compass. That is not arrogance. It is, in a profound sense, humility rooted in reality. Because to make choices on your own terms is to accept the weight of responsibility for those choices. It's far easier to outsource your thinking to someone else, to adopt prepackaged narratives about what is good and what is bad, who the heroes are and who the villains are. But India refuses that easy path. And in that moment, Jaishankar's reply wasn't just about India. It was about the dignity of independent thought, about the courage it takes for a nation, or even an individual, to assert, we will not live by borrowed convictions. Think about that for a moment. How often do we as individuals let someone else's values dictate our actions simply because we fear judgment? How often do nations do the same? There's a profound lesson here. You cannot live a meaningful life, nor can a nation chart a meaningful path by merely echoing the convictions of others. You need your own foundation. And that is why this moment matters. It wasn't just a Q&A, an exchange. It was a clash of worldviews. A young student shaped by the moral architecture of her culture, meeting an Indian statesman embodying the civilizational depth of his. And in that brief interaction, the question shifted. It was no longer why doesn't India do what we think is right, but rather who gets to decide what is right in the first place. That's a question worth taking home with you tonight, because if you can't answer that for yourself, someone else will, and they'll live your life or run your country for you. When Jaishankar responded, it wasn't with the language of mere diplomacy. It was with something far more profound, a sense of rootedness. You could hear it in the tone, in the calm precision of his words, in the way he dismantled the assumption that India's foreign policy must be reactive or subordinate to anyone else's framework. That kind of response doesn't come from someone improvising on the spot. It comes from a deeply internalized understanding of who you are and why you stand where you stand. And this is what most people miss when they look at India's foreign policy. They see decisions in isolation, votes at the United Nations, trade agreements, strategic partnerships, but they fail to see the underlying philosophy, the civilizational confidence that informs those choices. India doesn't operate from a place of historical amnesia. This is a country that remembers its past, not nostalgically but instructively. For centuries, India was colonized, its agency stripped away, its voice subsumed into someone else's narrative of what it should be. To navigate global politics today without that memory would be to invite history to repeat itself. And that's what makes this foreign policy different. It isn't reactive as if India was simply responding to the pressures of the moment. It is deeply intentional, crafted through a long lens of civilizational continuity, a recognition that survival and dignity are not given. They are earned, maintained, and defended. This is why Jaishankar often speaks of strategic autonomy. It isn't just a policy stance, it's a philosophical commitment. It says, in essence, that India will not be reduced to an instrument of someone else's ambition. It will forge its path based on its unique blend of historical memory, geographical realities, and cultural values. That's not an easy position to take in a world that often rewards conformity, but it's the only way to preserve authenticity in the global arena. And it's worth noting that this approach isn't anti-Western or anti-anyone. It's pro-India. It's an assertion that engagement doesn't require submission, that partnerships can be built without dependence. Think about the psychological depth of that. On an individual level, isn't that what maturity really is? To know who you are so well that you can collaborate with others without being consumed by them. That's precisely what India is doing. It refuses to be cornered into binaries, the West or Russia, the US or China, democracy or development. Instead, it sees itself as a pole in its own right, a voice that cannot be dismissed or reduced. And when Jaishankar answers questions like the one posed by that young American, he does more than defend a policy. He articulates a worldview, a reminder that power without self-awareness is reckless and diplomacy without cultural grounding is hollow. This is why his replies resonate beyond the walls of press conferences or academic panels. They awaken something in the audience, the understanding that a nation's choices, like an individual's, are strongest when they emerge from a well-defined core. That's what makes this so compelling. India's foreign policy isn't merely a list of strategic moves. It's a declaration that identity matters in global politics. It's the assertion that you cannot navigate the world effectively if you don't know who you are. And maybe that's a lesson for all of us, because if you don't define yourself, someone else will, and they rarely have your best interests at heart. When we talk about India's foreign policy, it's impossible to ignore the friction between how India sees itself and how the West often chooses to frame it. And this isn't a new phenomenon. For decades, India has been placed under a microscope, judged by narratives that don't fully account for its complexities. When Western commentators or policymakers discuss India, they often rely on binaries good versus bad, democratic versus authoritarian, ally versus adversary. These simplifications might make for compelling headlines or classroom debates, but they fail to grasp the layered, sometimes contradictory, yet deeply rational way India engages with the world. That was the underlying issue with the question posed to Jaishankar. It wasn't just curiosity. It carried with it the weight of Western expectation. And you can feel that expectation if you listen carefully. Why isn't India aligned with us? Why doesn't it behave according to the moral framework we've constructed? But here's the problem. Those frameworks often emerge from Western historical experiences shaped by their own wars, their own ideological conflicts, their own self-perception as arbiters of global morality. They don't easily account for the priorities of a nation like India, which has an entirely different historical and cultural trajectory. This is where Jaishankar's brilliance comes through. He doesn't simply defend a particular decision, say India buying oil from Russia or taking a neutral stance on a conflict. He reframes the conversation. He says, in effect, your question assumes that your narrative is universal, but it isn't. We see the world through a different lens, and that's a radical thing to say in international discourse, because it disrupts the comfortable notion that Western moral framing is the default. To understand why that matters, we need to appreciate the psychological depth of India's position. For much of its modern history, India was told what to value by colonizers, by Cold War power blocs, by international institutions designed without its full participation. When a nation finally asserts we will decide what is in our interest, it's not merely a diplomatic statement. It's a reclamation of intellectual sovereignty. And that reclamation is unsettling for those accustomed to their values being accepted without question. Think about it personally for a moment. How often do people project their expectations onto you? How often are you subtly told, if you were good, if you were moral, you do it this way? And how liberating, but also how provocative is it to respond, no, I'll act based on my own informed convictions. That's precisely what India is doing on the world stage. It isn't rejecting cooperation. It's rejecting subordination. This is why Western narratives often clash with Indian realities. They are built on different assumptions about power, morality, and history. And when those two worldviews collide, there's tension. But tension isn't always bad. Sometimes it's necessary because it forces the question, who gets to define the moral high ground? And why should that authority always reside in one part of the world? That's the deeper meaning of Jaishankar's reply. It wasn't fiery for the sake of theater. It was corrective. It reminded the audience, both in that room and beyond, that India is not obligated to play the role others have written for it. It is writing its own script, and that, in the end, is what makes all the difference. If you take anything from this, let it be this: the right to define yourself, to live by your own narrative rather than the one imposed upon you, is not just a national privilege. It's a human one, and it's worth defending at all costs. One of the most striking elements of Jaishankar's response, and indeed India's foreign policy as a whole, is the unwavering commitment to strategic autonomy. Now that phrase might sound like diplomatic jargon, but it's anything but. It's a declaration of intent, a refusal to be a pawn in someone else's game. It means that India will pursue its interests, form its partnerships, and make its decisions on the basis of what best serves its people and its long-term vision, not on the basis of allegiance to this or that global power bloc. And that's a position that can make the world deeply uncomfortable, especially for those who are used to seeing nations fall neatly into line. You can see why this would clash with the expectations of Western audiences. For decades, geopolitics has been framed like a team sport. You're either with us or against us. But India's refusal to play by that binary isn't confusion, it's clarity. It's a recognition that the world isn't as simple as the narratives suggest. Take, for example, India's relationships with the United States, Russia, and China. The West often frames these relationships as choices, as if cultivating ties with Washington must mean severing ties with Moscow, or that opposing China must require absolute alignment with American interests. But India rejects that framework entirely. It says, in effect, we can engage with multiple powers simultaneously on our terms without being co-opted by any of them. That's not indecision, that's strategy. And it's worth noting how much courage that takes, because autonomy isn't free. It comes at the cost of criticism, sometimes even coercion. It means enduring lectures about morality from those who wield power, but often fail to live up to their own professed ideals. It means saying no when yes would be easier. But that's exactly what growing nations with self-respect, must do if they're serious about charting their own destiny. Psychologically, this is what adulthood looks like, isn't it? When you're young, you conform. You do what others expect because you fear exclusion or judgment. But maturity means the willingness to stand on your own, even if it means standing alone. And in many ways, India's foreign policy reflects that transition from a post-colonial state struggling for validation to a confident civilizational power that doesn't need constant approval to know it's on the right path. This is why Jaishankar's words hit so hard. They come from someone who doesn't just understand the mechanics of diplomacy, but who understands the psychology of power, how easy it is for nations to lose themselves when they fall into the trap of pleasing others. He makes it clear that strategic autonomy isn't about isolationism. It's about engagement without surrender. It's about being able to look every global power in the eye and say, we are partners, not dependents. We share interests, not identities, and our loyalty lies first and foremost with our own people. That's the essence of sovereignty. Not just the right to make decisions, but the courage to bear the consequences of those decisions. And that's what so many people miss. Autonomy isn't the easy way out. It's the harder, lonelier, but ultimately more dignified road. And perhaps that's the lesson here, not just for nations, but for individuals. You don't gain respect by conforming to every demand placed upon you. You gain it by knowing who you are, by standing your ground, and by refusing to be reduced to someone else's instrument. Because if you can't assert your own autonomy, then someone else will decide your fate for you, and they won't do it in your interest. What made Jaishankar's response so compelling wasn't just what he said. It was how he said it. There's an art to diplomacy, and it's not merely about being polite or evasive. It's about wielding language like a scalpel, precise and deliberate, cutting through confusion without drawing unnecessary blood. That's exactly what Jaishankar did. His tone wasn't flustered, nor was it apologetic. It carried a measured weight, the kind that forces people to lean in and really listen. And that's no accident. That's the result of years of refining the ability to communicate hard truths in ways that are both unflinching and palatable. Think about the challenge here. He wasn't speaking to an adversary across a negotiating table. He was answering a young student who asked a question that on the surface sounded innocent, but carried deep moral implications. That's a minefield for any statesman. Respond too defensively and you look insecure. Come across as too harsh and you risk alienating the audience. But Jaishankar did neither. He maintained composure, infused his reply with a quiet authority, and most importantly, reframed the conversation so that the student and everyone listening walked away seeing India's position in a new light. This is where intellectual diplomacy shines. It's not just about defending your policies. It's about shifting the terms of the debate. It's about saying, let's question the very assumptions you're making when you frame this issue. That's what he did. He took a seemingly straightforward query, why doesn't India fall in line with Western expectations, and transformed it into a much bigger philosophical discussion. And so, what began as a simple question from a young student transformed into a powerful moment of global introspection. It was never just about India's foreign policy. It was about something much deeper. The right of a nation to think independently, to chart its own course without constantly seeking permission from those who have historically dominated the global narrative. Jaishankar's response wasn't a rebuke, it was a revelation, a reminder that in a world increasingly shaped by competing interests and shifting alliances, clarity of identity and sovereignty of thought are not luxuries, they are necessities. India, through its foreign policy and leadership, is refusing to be cast in someone else's script. It is rejecting roles handed down by those who view the world through the narrow prism of past hegemony. And in doing so, it is not only asserting its place in the world, but also offering a new model of engagement, one based not on dependency or deference, but on dignity, dialogue, and determination. This isn't defiance for the sake of drama. It is a quiet confidence rooted in thousands of years of civilization, in the lived experience of colonization, and in the hard-earned wisdom of navigating complex modern realities. What makes this position even more compelling is that it is not closed off. India isn't slamming doors, it's opening them, but on its terms. It is extending its hand to those willing to engage in mutual respect, to those who understand that true partnership is not built on obedience, but on shared purpose. Strategic autonomy, then, is not just a foreign policy goal. It is a philosophical stance, a declaration that India knows who it is, what it values, and where it's headed. It reminds the world that alignment does not mean submission and that neutrality does not mean weakness. In fact, in a polarized world, the ability to hold nuanced positions, to navigate shades of gray while others demand black and white, is a mark of strength, not confusion. And Jaishankar's tone, measured, calm, precise, embodied that strength. He didn't need volume to make his point. He didn't need approval to validate his argument. He simply stood firm, anchored in conviction, offering not just a reply but a reframing of the very question itself. That is the essence of intellectual diplomacy. That is leadership. And perhaps that's the broader lesson here, not just for countries, but for each of us as individuals. The power to define your own story, to resist being boxed into narratives you did not choose, is one of the most profound freedoms we have. But it comes with responsibility. You must know who you are. You must be willing to face criticism. You must have the courage to walk alone when necessary, to speak truths that may be uncomfortable but are necessary. Because in the end, whether you're a nation or a person, borrowed convictions will never carry you far. Real strength begins when you stop imitating and start becoming. India is not just rising on the world stage. It is rising with clarity, conviction, and character. And that is a rise no one can ignore, and no force can derail.